Welcome back to Conflicts of Interest. This is episode 709, and today is November 12th, 2024. I'm the host of the show, Kyle Anzalone. On today's show, we're talking about the early news coming out of the Trump camp and who may or may not be in his forthcoming administration. So a lot of important stuff on today's show. Shared the Show is hosted at the Libertarian Institute. It's reprinted on the blog at antiwar.com, YouTube, Rumble, or Odysee for the video version of the show. It's up anywhere you can listen to podcasts. And follow me on Twitter at KyleAnzalone_. And we may have some new listeners to the show because we added about 500 new followers on Twitter this weekend, which was a huge number. We're now up well over 7,000 followers on Twitter. So if you're new, welcome aboard, and just make sure you're subscribed to the show somewhere so you don't miss an episode, because we're going to be covering a lot of news on the show this week, and I got a really great interview coming up for y'all as well. All right, starting off with this one from Dave DeCamp at antiwar.com. Trump pits Mike Waltz as national security advisor. So President-elect Donald Trump has asked Mike Waltz, a hawkish Republican from Florida, to be his national security advisor in the upcoming administration, multiple media outlets reported on Monday night. Waltz was a staunch supporter of the Ukraine proxy war early on and was one of the few members of Congress to suggest the U.S. send military advisors into the country. He was also critical of President Biden for supposedly not being aggressive enough in his support for Ukraine. In 2023, Waltz began to express skepticism of the war, saying that the U.S. involvement in the conflict was not sustainable. However, in an interview with NPR last week, Waltz suggested that he would advise the president not to end the war in Ukraine, but escalate. And so that obviously isn't going to end the war, it's going to escalate it. When explaining how he thinks Trump could bring both sides to the table, Waltz said the U.S. could ramp up sanctions enforcement on Russia and support Ukraine using NATO-provided weapons for long-range strikes inside Russia, something Russian President Vladimir Putin has made clear would risk a nuclear war. So Waltz told NPR, first and foremost, you would enforce the actual energy sanctions on Russia. Russia is essentially a gas station with nukes. Putin is selling more oil and gas now than he did pre-war through China and Russia. And you couple that with unleashing our energy, lifting our LGN ban, and his economy and his war machine will dry up very quickly. So I think that Putin will get to the table. We will have leverage, like taking the handcuffs off long-range weapons provided to Ukraine as well. And then, of course, I think we have plenty of leverage with Zelinsky to get them to the table. So, I mean, this is completely insane. This is essentially what you would expect to hear from John McCain had he been made Trump's national security advisor. So, discussing Iran, Waltz said that the U.S. must go back to the maximum pressure, referring to the policy under the previous Trump administration, which involved withdrawing from the 2015 Iran nuclear deal, imposing crippling economic sanctions on Tehran, and assassinating the Iranian Quds Force Commander General Qasem Soleimani. Waltz was also hyping up claims about Iran plotting to kill Trump, which Iranian officials have denied, and we'll talk about that more later on the show. Waltz is a staunch supporter of Israel and has repeated Trump's calls to allow Israel to, quote, finish the job in Gaza. He wrote in an article for The Economist, the next administration should, as Trump argued, let Israel finish the job and get it over with fast. Against Hamas, they should put credible military options on the table to make it clear to the Iranians that the Americans would stop them from building nuclear weapons, which of course Iran isn't doing. And so what he's just talking about is echoing the Israeli threats that if Iran doesn't stop, say, its support for the Syrian government, the Shia militias in Iraq, Hezbollah in Lebanon, then they would attack Iran. That's the real red line, I think, is not the nuclear program, because Iran's not trying to make nukes. Waltz argued in The Economist that the U.S. is too bogged down in the Middle East and Ukraine and should be more focused on China, which is absolutely baffling, given that his policy is calling for doubling down in both the Middle East and Ukraine. He is known as one of the biggest China hots in Congress, declaring back in 2001 the U.S. was in a Cold War with China. He frequently calls for the U.S. to send more weapons to Taiwan, saying last year the U.S. should arm the island to the teeth. The Pentagon has declared that China, the most comprehensive and serious military challenge to the United States national security, and the U.S. military is openly preparing for a direct future war with Beijing, despite the risk of nuclear war. And so this is a rather bad sign that Waltz is going to be in the administration. Another bad sign, Trump nominates Rep. Elise Stefanik as ambassador to the United Nations. So President-elect Donald Trump confirmed on Monday that he has nominated Representative Elise Stefanik, a Republican from New York, to be his ambassador to the United Nations, a pick that is a victory for the Hawks. Stefanik is a staunch Israel supporter and Iran hawk who has said there should be no conditions on U.S. military aid to Israel. So Stefanik told the Israeli Knesset earlier this year in a speech where she bashed President Biden for delaying a shipment of 2,000-pound bombs to Tel Aviv, there is no excuse for an American president to block aid to Israel. Stefanik led the charge against college students protesting against U.S. support for Israel, smearing them as anti-Semitic for opposing Israel's onslaught in Gaza, even though many demonstrators were Jewish themselves. Stefanik told the Israeli Knesset, "I led the charge to expose this moral rot of anti-Semitism infecting our supposed most elite higher education as institutions." So placing Stefanik at the United Nations is a clear sign that the Trump administration will continue Biden's policy of covering for Israel at the UN. Stefanik has previously accused the UN of being anti-Semitic, a claim constantly made by Israeli officials, including Netanyahu. The Israeli ambassador to the United Nations, Danny Danon, celebrated Stefanik's nomination. He said, "At a time when hate fills the halls of the United Nations, your unwavering moral clarity is needed more than ever, which you all success in standing firm for truth and justice." Stefanik was first elected to Congress in 2014. Before that, she worked at hawkish think tanks, including the Foundation for the Defense of Democracies and the Foreign Policy Initiative, which was founded by neoconservative Bill Kristol and Robert Kagan. So again, bad sign. Now, here's what I want to say about Trump's, who we're talking about becoming and who's going to be in Trump's cabinet. This isn't the Biden administration. And so I think there's a couple or probably three major differences here. One, we're going to see, I'm imagining, like the first administration, a lot more personnel turnover. And between now and confirmation, which for the National Security Advisor, for the UN Ambassador, Secretary of State, Secretary of Defense, we really could be looking at 3, 4, 5, even 6 months before these people are actually getting confirmed and put in those positions. And so there's a lot of time between now and then for Trump to get tired of these people and fire them, or for us to make the case against them so effectively that Trump goes ahead and fires them. So, just because, say, Stefanik is named the UN ambassador doesn't necessarily mean she's going to become the UN ambassador. Then you have cases like Mike Waltz and other people who have reportedly been named to key positions, like Rubio as Secretary of State, Waltz as the National Security Advisor. I certainly am very appreciative to Dave because he did a great job reporting on this. You just need to keep in mind that, and this is something that happened a lot during the first Trump administration as well. And I think this is a combination of two things, but the reporting on what is happening in the Trump administration is often inaccurate. And so a first part of this is, I think the mainstream media just is looking to sabotage the Trump campaign. And so reporting on rumors and thinly sourced, speculation is essentially something that's going to happen a lot more during the Trump campaign than versus the Biden campaign. I'm sure a part of this is nefarious, and a part of this is just the, people in the mainstream media, are all hyped up and overly emotional about Trump returning to office. And so I think sometimes confirmation bias, they want to, get into the speculation, but also just, they want to be a part of all the turmoil and chaos of the Trump administration. So jumping at any little scrap of rumor and engaging in reporting, I think is something we're going to see a lot of. I also think Trump tells a lot of things to a lot of different people. And so I'm sure people leave meetings with Trump feeling like they're going to get a job that Trump has no intention of ever giving him. And then I also think there's a component of this where, because the Trump administration, at least, either because of its own internal disorganization, because Trump isn't as savvy politically, doesn't understand the Washington beast as much as Joe Biden or say, Barack Obama, George Bush did, or because people within, Trump's camp feel that way. I think there's like people around Trump that say want to make Marco Rubio the Secretary of State. And one of the ways that you could maybe do that is go to the Washington Post and the New York Times. And you could say, I'm a source close inside the Trump administration. And I think, and I know that he's going to name Marco Rubio the Secretary of State or Mike Pompeo the Secretary of Defense. And then the Wall Street Journal runs a headline, Trump to name Mike Pompeo Secretary of Defense. And that's all people read. And so people just start to get the foregone conclusion that Mike Pompeo is going to be the Secretary of Defense. And I'm sure at times this actually is effective in kind of constraining or tying Trump's hands to a certain decision. At the same time, we'll see where Trump will just come out and tweet, Pompeo and Nikki Haley won't be in my administration. And so for the seeming negatives of Trump, making Waltz the NSA and Stefanik the ambassador to the UN, we have heard directly from Donald Trump that Pompeo and Nikki Haley, two of the most outspoken Republican hawks, won't be in his administration. And so, you could find some good and bad still. And also Don Jr., his son, who seems to have a lot of influence in the current administration, is retweeting Dave Smith saying, we don't want neocons in the administration. So there are some good signs as well. I don't want to just poo-poo what is coming out of the Trump camp so far. Although, certainly if Waltz does end up as the national security advisor and Stefanik as the ambassador to the UN, these are, bad signs and bad people to have in his administration. And I know there are people who say, well, Donald Trump's a strong leader and he likes to have people around him who disagree with him. And look, I think that in certain cases, that's probably an effective management style and could lead to very successful results because it's going to, mean that you don't surround yourself with yes men, right? You have people that disagree with you. However, in the U.S. government, we'll say time and time again on this show over the next few months, especially, personnel is policy. And so if Trump makes an ultra hawk his national security advisor, that's going to be the policy, even if Trump himself doesn't want to be an ultra hawk. We saw this with John Bolton, with James Mattis, and other people in his administration who really undercut his policy, wanting to end wars in Somalia, Syria, make a deal with North Korea, get along better with Russia. If you appoint hawks, that's just not going to come to fruition. And so hopefully Trump understands that and he really doesn't plan to put all these hawks in his administration. Next up here, Kremlin denies report of Trump Putin call, says it's pure fiction. And so we had reports that Donald Trump and Vladimir Putin spoke, and the Kremlin came out on Monday and denied a report that Russian President Putin held a phone call with President-elect Donald Trump last week. The Washington Post reported on Sunday that Trump spoke with Putin on Thursday and advised the Russian leader not to escalate in Ukraine. The Kremlin spokesperson Dmitry Peskov said there was no conversation. This is completely untrue. It's pure fiction. Now, in a sense, I have no problem if Trump were to reach out to Vladimir Putin and start to engage in diplomacy because Trump's going to take office in just over 2 months here. And if there's a deal already in the progress, well, then we're going to end the fighting and the dying in Ukraine sooner, which is a good thing. At the same time, if Trump is reaching out to Vladimir Putin already, I think there's other problems that this is going to create. One, the media is going to try to use it to reignite the Russiagate hysteria and last time that was effective in constraining Trump's Russia policy, so that could be problematic. Also, there are some laws about private citizens, and since Trump technically isn't elected, engaging in foreign diplomacy kind of behind the back of the American government. And this is something they tried to attack Trump with the last time he came into office. Again, I'm for the talks, and so I think it would be good if it was happening. I just think that this is largely meant to reignite the Russiagate fears. All right, so next up here, Zelinsky felt reassured after call with Trump. So this is something I posted on X. So President-elect Donald Trump spoke with Zelinsky on Wednesday. This was of last week, leaving the Ukrainian leader feeling reassured. According to Axios, Zelinsky was somewhat reassured by what he heard from the president-elect. Zelinsky himself felt the fact that the call happened so soon after Trump was declared the winner of the election was a positive sign. Three sources briefed on the call told Axios that Zelinsky felt that the call went well and that it did not increase his anxiety about Trump's victory. One source said it didn't leave Zelinsky feeling a feeling of despair. So Trump told Zelinsky during that meeting, "I promise you will be happy with me," according to a source with knowledge of the call. According to sources, and this is what generally drew the headlines around the call, was that Elon Musk was on the call and pledged to continue to give Zelinsky access to the SpaceX Starlink internet communication system that the Ukrainians have been using both for their civilian government and for their military to wage the war against Russia and Ukraine. All right, next up, this is really the only non-Trump story I have on today's show. Biden will send American military contractors to Ukraine. The Washington Post reported this last week. The Pentagon said Friday that it will send a small number of U.S. defense contractors to Ukraine, where they will repair advanced American-made weapons, including F-16 fighter jets and Patriot air defense systems, donated by Western allies amid the Russia's invasion. Their employers will be responsible for the contractor safety and security while in Ukraine, and risk mitigation plans will be required as a part of the company's bid for the work. U.S. defense officials declined to say where in Ukraine the contractors would be based, citing security sensitivities, but noted that numerous U.S. companies already have personnel in the country to perform work for the Ukrainian government. U.S. contractors also already have signed contracts with the State Department and the U.S. Agency for International Development, including to bolster Ukraine's energy grid, as is attacked by Russian airstrikes and drones. A significant amount of international help for Ukraine is based in the western part of the country, far from the front lines. And so I thought the way the Washington Post reported this was interesting. That's part of the reason I wanted to discuss it on the show, is because they make it sound like this isn't a major escalation because, the State Department and USAID is already there. And of course, these agencies are civilian agencies. And so USAID having Americans, say, repair energy infrastructure while Russia is attacking it and saying that infrastructure, and it likely is being used for military purposes, there's a big difference between attacking, a maintenance worker, attacking a electrician versus attacking, say, somebody working on a Patriot system or an F-16. So I do think that they will be far more likely to be attacked. My guess is that Russia is going to figure out fairly quickly where these people are. I'm not sure if Russia is going to want to attack them to escalate the war in that way. At the same time, they could see it as being, hey, a valuable target. Not only are they taking out the Westerners helping repair the systems, but they're also taking out these advanced systems. I do know a lot of these repair jobs are also happening outside of Ukraine, so it's possible that, maybe they're going to ship them just across the border into Poland or Romania, and that's where the Americans will actually be stationed. But this is a recipe for a massive, massive escalation, and very concerned that this is going to turn into something bad if the American contractors end up getting killed in Ukraine. All right, so let's talk quickly here about how the election and Trump's victory may impact the situation in the Middle East. Netanyahu says he spoke with Trump 3 times since election. So the Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu said Sunday they spoke with President-elect Donald Trump 3 times since his election victory last week, and that they were on the same page about Iran. So Netanyahu said, "These were very good and important conversations. We see eye to eye on the Iranian threat in all its components and the danger it poses. We also see the great opportunities that Israel faces in the field of peace and its expansion and in other areas." Netanyahu was one of the first foreign leaders to call Trump on his election victory, and it's likely trying to influence the president-elect to continue providing support for Israel's military operations in Gaza, Lebanon, Syria, and the West Bank. A senior Israeli official told Axios that Netanyahu is sending one of his top aides, Minister of Strategic Affairs Ron Dermer, to Mar-a-Lago this week. He is also meeting with the Biden administration officials in Washington, but Israeli media said the real purpose of the trip was to hold talks with Trump and his advisors. And so I wonder if Netanyahu's plan is to conduct as much ethnic cleansing in Gaza as possible before Trump takes office, and they're going to try to put the Palestinians in as small as area as possible in the Gaza Strip, which over the long run won't be able to maintain the population size, and with the aid restrictions it is going to force the Palestinians to either starve or leave. I think that's the plan, and I think he's trying to get to the point where they're done conducting, the major door-to-door kind of military operations that they're doing right now in northern Gaza, in Jabalia, where, they're forcing every single Palestinian south of the Nazarene corridor. And so I think Trump would like Netanyahu to be done with that phase of the war by the time he takes office. And Netanyahu may actually try to oblige that. That way, when he wants to continue to escalate in Lebanon, to annex the West Bank, he feels like, maybe Trump feels like he owes Netanyahu one for getting all this messiness done in Gaza before he comes into office. I think that's going to be kind of the Trump mentality, or at least the cards that Netanyahu is going to try to play. I'm not sure how this all plays out, but I do think that Trump would like the fighting in Gaza to be done or wrapping up by the time he gets into office. And when I say fighting, I don't mean Israel ends its military occupation of Gaza and allows the Palestinians to start to rebuild, but the daily attacks, these scenes of, hospitals being bombed, schools being bombed, children being dismembered, I think Trump would legitimately like that to be done by the time that he enters office. Now, this isn't because I think he loves Palestinians and is concerned about what the Israelis are doing, but he sees the negative press that is generating. And also, during his first administration, the bodies of dead children did seem to be something that moved Trump from time to time. And so it could certainly be a threat for the Israelis that, you could turn Trump a little bit against you if you're killing a bunch of children with American-made bombs. The other thing I wanted to say about Trump when it comes to Israel is, a lot of times his words could be taken one way or the other. So when he says, I want the Israelis to finish the job, that could mean like, just end your operations and leave, like declare victory and go home. It could also mean finish the job of what Netanyahu wants to do, which is ethnically cleanse the Gaza Strip. And so Trump is saying, like, I don't care what you got to do, just get it over with sooner. And one sense is very dark, one sense has a little bit of positive. And so it's very hard to see which direction at this point the Trump administration is going to go when it comes to the Middle East. If you look at his first administration, you see, I think, a lot of contradictions where in one sense, he was probably the most hawkish American president when it came to Iran. I mean, maybe if you count President Dick Cheney, it's a little bit different, but certainly an extremely hawkish American president towards Iran. Yet when there were 2 opportunities where he probably had the political capital, given the situation, the downing of an American drone over the Persian Gulf, and then the attack on an American base in Iraq after the assassination of Qasem Soleimani, Trump probably could have taken America to war, or at least carried out a massive American attack inside Iran at that time, and he elected not to. He chose de-escalation at a time where I think that the Biden administration would have felt like their hands were tied into escalating and going ahead and attacking in Iran. At the same time, Trump completely unnecessarily broke the Iran nuclear deal and turned Tehran into a potential ally, into a firm I don't want to say enemy, but certainly a state that doesn't want to cooperate with Washington. And so, Trump's policies in the Middle East are just kind of all over the place, and they really contradict with each other, which means, again, who he has in his administration is going to really dictate how this policy actually plays out in the Middle East. In one sense, you could see Trump trying to get along better with the Iranians. In another, we have these reports that Iran was behind the assassination of Trump. Who knows if Trump believes that's true or not? If he does, maybe he wants to take the Americans to war with Iran. Lots of possibilities here. All right, my biggest concern about Trump's presidency and what it means for the Middle East is that he's going to allow the annexation of the West Bank. So Bezalel Smotrich, the Israeli finance minister, said Monday that Donald Trump's victory in the U.S. presidential election provides an important opportunity for the annexation of settlements in the occupied West Bank. Smotrich said, using the biblical term for the West Bank, the year 2025, with God's help, the year of sovereignty in Judea and Samaria. The Israeli minister said he had no doubt that President Donald Trump, who showed courage and determination in his first term, will support the state of Israel in this move. And there's a couple reasons I think Trump is going to go for this. One, Israel has more or less already de facto annexed the West Bank. Now, it certainly hasn't happened, and going ahead and announcing it would be a bad thing. I'm not saying that. But with all the settlement expansion going on and how broken up all the Palestinian cities that still remain in the West Bank are, without removing the settlers from the West Bank, you can't have any piece of a Palestinian state there. And so, in a sense, the facts on the ground, the way they are now, make a Palestinian state in the West Bank impossible. And so I think Trump is kind of going to be the way he was, say, with the Golan Heights. Oh, well, this is effectively Israel now. They're obviously not going to give it back. And so what's the harm of just making it official policy that the Israelis aren't giving the Golan Heights back to Syria, that the Israelis aren't giving the West Bank back to the Palestinians? I think that could very easily be Trump's line of thinking here. Also, there's a lot of money, and a lot of money that's already been given to Donald Trump to annex the West Bank. And so, again, I think it's more likely than not that during the Trump administration, they announced the annexation of the West Bank and the U.S. bats it in Israel. However, again, I'm making predictions when we don't know for sure who's going to be in the Trump camp. And look, you certainly probably have potential secretaries of state that would be against that, and maybe it doesn't happen then. All right, last article up here, this one from Dave DeCamp, November 10th, antiwar.com. Iran strongly denies U.S. claims it was involved in plot to kill Trump. So the Iranian Foreign Ministry has strongly denied U.S. claims that Iran was involved in the alleged plot to kill President-elect Donald Trump, dismissing the charges as complete matters between the U.S. and Iran. On Friday, the U.S. Justice Department announced charges over the alleged plot, claiming that Iranian officials asked an Afghan national who currently resides in Tehran to surveil and ultimately assassinate Trump. The Iranian foreign minister wrote on X, "Who can in their right mind believe the supposed assassin sits in Iran and talks online to the FBI?" He said that Iran respects the choice of the American people, what they made in the presidential election. He said the American people have made their decision, and Iran respects their right to elect a president of their choice. The path forward is also a choice. It begins with respect. He also reiterated that Iran does not seek nuclear weapons and signaled Iran is willing to talk with the U.S. about its nuclear program. So this is maybe good news. We also have on Saturday, Javad Zarif, Iran's vice president for strategic affairs, calling on Trump not to continue the maximum pressure policy against Iran. Trump must show that he is not following the wrong policies of the past. And the Iranians could have said when Trump took office, this guy again was an absolute terror, destroyed the U.S.-Iran relationship. The Iran nuclear deal that really could have fixed the relationship was gone because of Trump. And, now we're shifting even more towards Moscow, Beijing, and other countries that are isolated by the U.S. in response, but saying, hey, we're open to talks. Maybe some talks could happen, although Middle East is especially... The problem is I really can't imagine Trump de-escalating with Iran. And without de-escalating with Iran, we could see some minor de-escalation when it comes to the Gaza Strip in Lebanon. But ultimately, the Middle East is going to remain on very high tensions if Donald Trump tries to continue the maximum pressure campaign against Iran and allows Israel to, say, carry out assassinations inside Iran and things like that. All right, that's where I'm wrapping up the show for today. Thank you all so much for tuning in. More shows later this week, including an interview coming up tomorrow.